It's a really great pleasure to introduce Dr. Roman Pabayo, who is visiting us. He is a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard School of Public Health, where he does research on social determinants of health and health inequities, and he'll talk about some of that research in relationship to physical activity. And he actually holds a bachelor's and a master's in nutrition, and his Master of Science he earned at McGill, and then he completed his thesis and PhD degree at the University of Montreal, and he also spent some time at the University of Alberta. So we're delighted to have you here visiting with us, Roman. I know you've had a chance to meet a few people, and you have a chance to meet a few more. So turned over to you. A bottle of water will magically show up at some point here, and then we can plan to have you answer questions at the end unless someone has a burning need for clarification. How does that sound?
Great.
Great.
Thank you. Just want to thank everyone for coming. It's a very large audience, more than expected. Before I start, I want to say that I'm glad I didn't listen to the advice of my mentor, Chiro Coach. I usually do listen to his advice. He gives really good advice, but he told me, or he wanted me to put up, make my slides and my tie the color of red and gray, just to see what the reaction would be. It's sort of an odd sense of humor. So, a dark sense of humor. So thank you all for coming. So today I'm going to talk to you about social environment and in particular physical activity. I'm going to present two studies, and I also want to talk about my future direction. So here's a brief outline. It's going to go over what's the problem, and I'm also going to go over the social determinants of health conceptual framework that I base a lot of my work on. I'm going to talk about two studies looking at the social contextual characteristics at the neighborhood level, and I'm going to talk about another study at the school level. Then I'm going to have a discussion and future directions. So this graph indicates that most American youth are not meeting the physical activity recommendations. And these recommendations are made from the CDC and the American College of Sports Medicine, and they recommend that adolescents and youth should achieve or participate in 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity per day. And we know through the literature and through other studies, and this is particularly 2008 study using accelerometer data, that most children, especially boys and girls, once they reach 12 and 15, do not meet these physical activity requirements. So what's going on? So why aren't youth being physically active? And I look at the social determinants of health. And the social determinants of health have been defined as conditions in which people are born, grow, age, live, and work. And they're shaped by the distribution of money, power, and resources. So not everyone has access to certain amenities. They don't have access to certain resources too well. It's very varied across the distribution. So it's a complex model. It's not just about the individual. It looks at the environment and how individuals and groups interact with their environment and also with each other. So here's an example of the social determinants of health. Now, it's been endorsed by the World Health Organization, and they define health, which is usually the outcome, health and well-being, as simply not just an absence of disease. It's also defined as a complete state of physical, psychological, mental, and spiritual well-being. It also points to behavioral mediators such as physical activity and diet that act in between individual level determinants such as income and gender, for example. So we know, for example, people from lower socioeconomic status backgrounds accumulate, on average, less physical activity levels in comparison to those from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. And gender, for example, is another example of an individual level determinant where girls, on average, are more likely to be physically inactive in comparison to boys. So I look at the contextual determinants, for example, the neighborhoods and schools, and I'm going to go over through a study from each one, an example for each one in this talk. So we know that the environment, that the literature has indicated, the environment is associated with our physical activity behavior. So I'm going to give an example of the built environment. The built environment is defined as density of destinations. So there are a lot of destinations for you to go to in your particular neighborhood. Street connectivity, with a lot of intersections, population density, access to transit. Now all these factors make up the built environment, and they've been shown to be associated with increased likelihood of using active transportation. So, but however, this is only one aspect of the total environment. And I'm going to talk today about the social environment. Now the social environment is comprised of how we interact with our neighbors. Not necessarily just in the neighborhood setting, but also our coworkers in a workplace setting, and also our fellow students and our teachers in a school setting. And also access to services such as access to recreation facilities, access to parks. So I'm going to give 3 examples. I'm going to go through each of these in the next couple slides. I'm going to go over economic deprivation, social fragmentation, and social cohesion. When I talk about the area level, I'm going to talk about, so these characteristics can be described at the neighborhood level, the county level, and the state level, or at the school level. So economic deprivation is a collective measure of average socioeconomic position. So it's populations within a particular area. So what is the average socioeconomic status of a particular area of a such as a neighborhood? So what is the average or the median household income of a particular neighborhood? So these are examples of measures that could measure economic deprivation. For example, percent in poverty. So what's the percentage of poverty live in a particular neighborhood? The unemployment rate, and you can say the percent with a bachelor's degree, or you can say the percent that had dropped out of high school. Now, social fragmentation is something different. It was defined, or first came up with, by Émile Durkheim, who's a French sociologist. He was a French sociologist, and its literal translation means a state of normlessness. And it is indicative of a breakdown of social bonds between individuals and their community. So in the literature, it's been used as a form of sort of instability. So anything that indicates a greater population turnover. So measures include residents moving out of a residential area in the last 5 years, single-person households, and the the proportion of residents who are renting. So these are examples of instability, population turnover. So does anyone know what, I don't have a pointer, anyone know what this neighborhood is? You recognize that? Yeah, Fenway. And I don't know if anyone can see this. This is a neighborhood right next to McGill University in Montreal. So these are student neighborhoods, right? So there's a high population turnover. So this is an example of a high socially fragmented neighborhood. So I tried to find one for Ann Arbor, but the cabbie told me that 75% of Ann Arbor is comprised of students. So it can be a high turn. So we can say Ann Arbor has a high socially fragmentation. So social cohesion is something that is defined by the connectedness and the solidarity between groups, among groups in society. So in other words, it's an absence of latent social conflict. Now this source of social conflict could be disparities between income, so high and versus low income, and racial or ethnic tensions. So when you have a socially cohesive environment, you have strong social bonds between members in the society. So measures include trust. So how well do you trust your neighbor to look after your children when they walk to school? How well do you trust your neighbors when you decide to go away, and are they going to look after your property? Okay. Civic participation, voting has been used as an indication of social cohesion, and same with volunteering. So for my ever since I started doing research as a graduate student, I concentrated mostly on the relationship between the independent variables, so the social environmental exposure, and the dependent variables, such as active transportation to school. So for example, I looked at safety within an environment as a social environmental factor. and active transportation to school. So I looked at the association between these two. And also, another example is if they had a grocery store close by in their neighborhood, residential neighborhood, and a decreased likelihood of soft drink consumption among toddlers in the Edmonton, Alberta region. But I never looked at possible mediators. So when I started to work at Harvard School of Public Health with Ichiro Kawachi, he started pushing me to look at potential mediators. What are the mechanisms involved that could lead from the social environment to your behavioral outcomes? So, for example, let's use social fragmentation. So instability, population turnover. How is it associated with physical activity? So it could act through potential mediators such as stress, depression, perception of social cohesion, perception of safety, social capital, and social exclusion. Now these have all been significant potential outcomes of social fragmentation in the literature, but also these could also be predictors of physical activity. So the potential mediators. So for the two studies I'm going to talk about today, this is already data that I've already collected. I decided I could only use actually perception of safety, perception of social cohesion. Now this is on the individual level. So what are the research gaps? So there's been limited evidence between social fragmentation and physical activity. So social fragmentation has mostly been looked at in Europe, in England, for example, where they found they have observed significant relationships between social fragmentation and mental health outcomes such as stress, depression, and suicide attempts. And there's only been one study where we've applied social fragmentation, so population turnover at the school level. And this was a paper published in 2010. Thank you. And there's also been methodological weaknesses too in the studies that have been conducted looking at social fragmentation. For example, multiple regression analyses, they have controlled for individual level factors, but they haven't controlled for other neighborhood or area or contextual level factors. And they haven't looked at potential mediators. So we'll go over the first study, looking at an example of neighborhood social fragmentation on their effect on their association with physical inactivity. So this is a study called the relationship between neighborhood socioeconomic characteristics and physical inactivity among adolescents living in Boston, Massachusetts. So the objective is to see or to investigate what are the associations between the socioeconomic conditions and physical activity, and also to identify potential mediators. So the hypotheses are that high social fragmentation and high economic deprivation are related or significantly associated with increased likelihood of being physically inactive, and high social cohesion is protective against being physically inactive. This is above and beyond the effects of individual and area level factors, and also potentially perception of safety and social cohesion are acting as mediators. So the data come from the Boston U study, the 2008 Boston U study. Just under 1,900 students participated in the study. It's originally it was used to measure health, not only health behaviors, but also use of school and community resources, and also the original intention of the study was to look at the exposure to violence and also what the effects of violence are. And it was a biennial survey, a cross-sectional survey of students from grades 9 to 12. And it's representative of the Boston public school students. So 22 eligible schools participated, so it's 71%. And students were living in 38 neighborhoods. And so I had complete data for just under 70%. So the outcome was moderate to vigorous physical activity. And we asked the students on a questionnaire in the past 7 days on how many days did you exercise or participate in physical activity for at least 20 minutes that made you sweat or breathe hard. And we gave examples such as playing basketball, walking briskly, playing soccer. And participants were categorized into inactive, so they indicated they didn't participate in any physical activity, or active, 1 to 7 days. Individual level characteristics include nativity, so if they were US born or foreign born, race or ethnicity. Mediators included perceived safety and social cohesion. Now for the neighborhood level factors, I also looked at, I had to link the Boston Youth Survey to three data sets. The first one, the Boston Neighborhood Study. And the Boston Neighborhood Study is a representative sample of adults, and we surveyed them, and we asked them how they felt, what their perception of social cohesion was. So an average score is created for each of the 38 neighborhoods participating in the BYS. And then disorder, we measured disorder through the BNF, through the Boston Neighborhood Study. We asked the adults if they had graffiti on in their neighborhoods, if they had broken glass, was there a lot of vandalism. Okay, so this disorder score was, the average disorder score was determined for each of the neighborhoods. So also Boston GIS data was used to determine the crime rates, the average crime rates of each of the